Welcome to CivilNet. Joining me via Skype from New York City in the United States is Nate Shenkkan. He's the program officer with Freedom House. Nate, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We've been trying to connect with you for the last several weeks to talk about an article you had written in Foreign Affairs about the Eurasian Economic Union, and you had called it Eurasian Disunion, actually. As some of our viewers might know, on January 2nd of this year, Armenia became a full member state of that union that includes Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And not with a bit of controversy, actually. Nate, talk to me, if you will, about the reason for writing the article, why you feel that the Eurasian Economic Union started off on the wrong foot or doesn't really have a very bright or long future ahead of it.
Sure. The Eurasian Economic Union has had a very big year. And in fact, this is the third of 3 articles that I've written for Foreign Affairs in the last year covering its development since May, when the final treaty was negotiated between Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Russia. The year really started with the Ukraine crisis. And I think it's easy for us to forget right now, with everything that's happening in Ukraine and vis-a-vis Russia, that this really started with a dispute over a trade agreement. The Yanukovych administration had decided at the last minute to reject the European Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. And that was seen as a choice for the Eurasian Economic Union. And so the Maidan revolution that deposed Yanukovych and has changed everything geopolitically for this entire region was a rebellion, in a sense, against the Eurasian Economic Union. And so from the start of this whole process with Ukraine, the EEU has come under much heavier pressure. And we're starting to see the inconsistencies in the conception of the EEU, the disagreements about how it should work, really come into focus. And in my opinion, it's becoming much more of a pro forma institution than the actual law-based, rule of law kind of institution that it might have looked like 3 or 4 years ago.
Right. I mean, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of these newly independent states, there have been many attempts by Moscow to create some kind of union. The CIS, then there was, Guam, and then there's the Collective Security Treaty Organization, KISTO, as we know, which is a military alliance. A lot of them have been sort of not very effective. Now, this started off, it started off after the Ukraine issue, but it started off as a customs union, and there was, a framework for that was understandable, but then it sort of morphed or transformed into the Eurasian Economic Union. Now, is it fair to say, I think it goes without saying, but let's just say it for the record, that this is Moscow's attempt to create a balance to the European Union, to show that it is a regional power, a global player. But you mentioned in your article, why Armenia and Kyrgyzstan to be part of this Eurasian Economic Union when they are both peripheral economies? Armenia doesn't even have a border with the members of the EU. So
yeah, the Armenia and Kyrgyzstan accession really speaks to what you were saying about how the Union has become a Russian project to reconstitute some kind of union in the post-Soviet space. It's important to remember, though, that the project originally actually started with very strong support from Kazakhstan. And that's been one of the things that really distinguished it from these other projects that you mentioned, like the CSTO, is that President Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan really owned this project, spoke out in favor of it, made it something that he pushed through with a public that was not necessarily, and an elite that was not necessarily deeply in favor of it. And that is one of the key things that's broken down now in the last year, is that Kazakhstan increasingly is expressing dissent. Now with Armenia and Kyrgyzstan, why are they being added? They're being added right now because Russia needs to show a win. They need to show that despite the sanctions, despite the efforts to contain Russian influence that they see from NATO or from the West, nonetheless, their sphere of influence is expanding. They're capable of accumulating supporters and allies to their side.
Right. Talking about sanctions, I mean, it was the sort of the Western sanctions imposed on Russia and on Russian individuals and banks that really showed the cracks, I think, in this union, because of course it affected Belarus and Kazakhstan, and that's where we saw that more than being an economic union, as all things are in our world, the economy and politics are so intimately intertwined that you can't separate the two. And it really showed Moscow's sort of disparaging attitude toward its partners, did it not?
Definitely. It definitely did. And even more than the sanctions themselves, it was Russia's counter-sanctions that showed this dismissive attitude towards its partners. So at the time when Russia imposed its counter-sanctions on the EU, the food sanctions, at that time, Belarus and Kazakhstan were already in the customs union with Russia, legally sharing a single tariff, legally sharing restrictions on imports into that union. And nonetheless, Russia imposed those sanctions unilaterally, without consultation with Belarus, without consultation with Kazakhstan. This created a huge uproar. Kazakhstan and Belarus both have refused to impose the sanctions themselves on European food imports. And it's now created a real crisis, in particular with Belarus, because Belarus is still importing food from Europe because they refuse to recognize Russia's counter-sanctions. And quite a lot of that food, it appears, is making its way into Russia through a kind of gray or black re-export trade, whereby Belarusian importers bring in European goods, repackage them as Belarusian, and then export them into Russia under the customs union. And so that has created a huge uproar inside Russia and inside of Belarus. We're in fact at a point right now where there's a little bit of a trade war starting. And just this morning, I saw that President Lukashenko of Belarus is now threatening to leave the EU.
Well, there you go. I mean, I think that it's very important to make the distinction that the partners that are trying to form this EU, I mean, de jure and de facto it has been formed, but the longevity of it is coming into question because it's not, there's no equality among the members in terms of economy, in terms of power, in terms of strategic importance, in terms of natural resources. And so there's this huge imbalance. And that's why at this point, I suppose Russia can play those cards, thinking that it can get away with it. Whereas in the European Union example, yes, there were disparities, but not as glaring as they are with the EU. Is this a fair statement in your opinion, Nate?
It is up to a point. You know, there's no doubt that Russia has an enormous economic weight within the EU, far outstripping what Germany, for instance, has within the EU. If Germany accounts for some 30+% of the economy of the EU, Russia accounts for 80+% of the economy of the EU. Nonetheless, there are institutional ways in which the other countries of the Eurasian Economic Union do have equality or have leverage. They each have equal representation within the Commission, for example. And that ultimately is one of the things that's going to make it very difficult for Russia to further institutionalize the union or to develop it in a more political direction, to take it in some of the directions that some of the more Eurasianist advisors of President Putin have recommended. Ultimately, they can only go so far without cooperation, in particular from Kazakhstan and from Belarus, which do have the wherewithal and the economic stability to be able to resist Russian pressure. Armenia and Kyrgyzstan, however, are much more subject to being dictated by what Russia wants. And this is one of the reasons why Kazakhstan especially was quite opposed to their joining at this time. Kazakhstan didn't want to see its weight within the Commission and within the EU diluted by the addition of 2 weak members that it thought would be led entirely by Russia's interests.
All right. It was a fascinating conversation, Nate, and especially with the fall of the devaluation of the Russian ruble. Russia's economy is now in a downward spiral, the fall of oil prices. So the situation is very fluid, and I think that in the coming weeks and months, perhaps we'll be touching base with you again to see what the new developments are in this newly formed Eurasian Economic Union.
I hope so. I'm sure there will be many developments.
All right. Thanks so much. And I'd like to remind our viewers that my guest via Skype from New York was Nate Shenkkan, Program Officer with Freedom House. Stay with CivilNet.